Imagine a single mansion, a single night, a handful of survivors facing something humanity was never meant to encounter. What began as one team's fight for survival in 1996 would become the blueprint for an entire genre, spawning a franchise that has terrified, thrilled, and captivated millions across nearly 3 decades. From that first horrifying encounter with a zombie turning to face you in a dimly lit hallway, to globe-spanning bioterrorism conspiracies, from tank controls to first-person terror, Resident Evil hasn't just survived, it has evolved, adapted, and redefined what horror in gaming can be. This is the complete history of survival horror's greatest franchise, a story of corporations, viruses, heroes, and the thin line between humanity and monstrosity. Long before Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine stepped into that infamous mansion, the foundations of Resident Evil were being laid in unexpected places. The story begins not in 1996, but in 1989, when Capcom developer Takuro Fujiwara created a horror game for the Famicom called Sweet Home. Based on a Japanese horror film, Sweet Home featured many elements that would later define Resident Evil: limited inventory, puzzle solving, resource management, and most importantly, an overwhelming sense of dread. The game was ahead of its time, blending adventure game sensibilities with survival mechanics that forced players to think carefully about every action. Years passed, and in 1993, Fujiwara approached a young developer named Shinji Mikami with an ambitious proposal: create a spiritual successor to Sweet Home for the new generation of consoles. Mikami, who had become the father of survival horror, began work on what was internally called Biohazard. The development team studied horror films extensively, drawing inspiration from George A. Romero's zombie classics, particularly Dawn of the Dead and Night of the Living Dead. They wanted to capture that claustrophobic terror, that feeling of being trapped with limited resources while an unstoppable threat closed in from all sides. The original concept was even more ambitious than what would eventually release. Early prototypes featured more action-oriented gameplay, but Mikami deliberately pulled back, understanding that true horror came from vulnerability, not empowerment. The team crafted fixed camera angles that deliberately obscured threats, creating tension through what players couldn't see. Tank controls, which would later become both infamous and iconic, were designed to make movement feel deliberate and weighty, preventing players from easily dodging every threat. When it came time to release the game in North America, the team hit an unexpected obstacle. The name Biohazard was already trademarked by a DOS game and a New York hardcore punk band. Capcom held an internal contest among employees to find a new name. The winning entry was Resident Evil, a name that perfectly captured the malevolent presence dwelling within the Spencer Mansion. On March 22nd, 1996, Resident Evil was unleashed on the PlayStation, and gaming would never be the same. The premise was deceptively simple. The Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STIARS, Bravo team has gone missing in the Arklay Mountains near Raccoon City. Alpha team, consisting of Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Albert Wesker, Barry Burton and others, is sent to investigate. What they find is a nightmare. After being attacked by monstrous dogs in the forest, the team flees to a nearby mansion for shelter. But this is no ordinary mansion. It's a facade hiding one of Umbrella Corporation's secret research facilities. Players could choose between Chris and Jill, each offering a slightly different experience. Chris had more health and could take more damage, but carried fewer items. Jill, a master of unlocking, had access to more areas and could carry more supplies, but was more vulnerable in combat. This choice added replayability and allowed players to approach the game's challenges from different angles. The mansion itself was the true star. a sprawling labyrinth of ornate halls, hidden passages, and deadly traps. Every room could hide salvation or death, and with limited ammunition and healing items, every encounter required careful consideration. The game's atmosphere was masterfully crafted. The fixed camera angles created a sense of unease, never quite showing you everything. The soundtrack, often nothing more than ambient sounds and footsteps, made every creak of wood or distant moan feel significant. And then there were the moments that would become legendary in gaming history. The first zombie encounter, turning slowly to face you as it fed on Kenneth Sullivan's corpse, the dogs crashing through windows in that infamous hallway, and the revelation that your captain, Albert Wesker, was a traitor working for Umbrella all along. As players delved deeper, they uncovered the truth. Umbrella Corporation, ostensibly a pharmaceutical company, had been developing biological weapons using the T-virus, a mutagenic pathogen that reanimated dead tissue and created horrifying mutations. The mansion was a testing ground, and an outbreak had turned researchers into zombies and transformed creatures into grotesque BOWs, bioorganic weapons. The final confrontation with the tyrant, a pinnacle of Umbrella's research, demonstrated just how far the corporation would go in pursuit of the perfect bioweapon. Resident Evil was a commercial and critical success, selling millions of copies and essentially creating the survival horror genre. Critics praised its atmosphere, design, and innovative gameplay, though the voice acting became famously memeable with lines like, "You were almost a Jill sandwich," and "I hope this is not Chris's blood." The game's success convinced Capcom they had struck gold, and plans for expansion began immediately. Resident Evil had established the template: limited resources, puzzle solving, exploration, and an overwhelming atmosphere of dread. It was a formula that would be refined, evolved, and reimagined across nearly 3 decades. Though released years later in 2002 for the GameCube, Resident Evil 0 is chronologically the first chapter in the timeline, taking place on July 23, 1998, just 1 day before the events of the first game. This prequel tells the story of STS Bravo Team's ill-fated mission to the Arklay Mountains. Rebecca Chambers, the team's rookie medic, becomes separated from her unit when their helicopter makes an emergency landing. Investigating a nearby area, she discovers the Ecliptic Express, a luxury passenger train that has become a rolling death trap. Aboard the train, Rebecca encounters Billy Cohen, a former Marine sentenced to death for allegedly murdering 23 people. Despite his criminal status, the two form an uneasy alliance to survive the zombie-infested train. Resident Evil 0 introduced a revolutionary partner-switching mechanic, allowing players to control both Rebecca and Billy, each with unique abilities. Billy was stronger and could take more damage, while Rebecca could mix chemicals and access small spaces. The game required players to strategically position both characters, sometimes separating them to solve environmental puzzles. The investigation leads them from the train to the Umbrella Executive Training Center, where they uncover the origins of the T-virus outbreak in the Arklay Mountains. The truth is personal and tragic. Years earlier, Dr. James Marcus, one of Umbrella's co-founders, developed the original T-virus. When Umbrella executives Oswald Spencer and William Birkin ordered his assassination to steal his research, his pet leeches absorbed his genetic material. Decades later, those leeches had evolved into a creature capable of mimicking Marcus's form, seeking revenge by unleashing the virus. The game expanded Resident Evil's mythology significantly, revealing the corporate backstabbing and ethical darkness at Umbrella's core. It showed that the company's evil wasn't just cold corporate calculation, it was personal vendettas, stolen research, and brilliant minds consumed by ambition. The partnership mechanic, while sometimes frustrating due to AI limitations, added a new dimension to gameplay. Having a partner meant dividing resources, coordinating strategies, and occasionally using one character as bait while the other solved puzzles or flanked enemies. By the end, Rebecca and Billy defeat the Queen Leech, the evolved form of Marcus's mutated parasites, and escape before the facility's self-destruct sequence obliterates all evidence. Rebecca, showing a compassion that would define her character, helps Billy fake his death and escape military custody. She then regroups with what remains of Bravo Team and heads toward the Spencer Mansion, where the events of the first Resident Evil are about to begin. Zero provided crucial context for the series' mythology, while delivering solid survival horror gameplay, though its commercial reception was mixed due to releasing on the GameCube during a period when the franchise was in transition. If the first Resident Evil was a contained horror story in a single location, Resident Evil 2 expanded the nightmare to an entire city. Released on January 21, 1998, the sequel shifted the setting from the isolated Spencer Mansion to Raccoon City itself, now completely overrun by the undead. The game introduced two new protagonists whose stories would become central to the franchise. Leon S. Kennedy, a rookie police officer arriving for his first day on the job, and Claire Redfield, a college student searching for her missing brother Chris. The brilliance of Resident Evil 2 lay in its dual scenario system. Players could start with either Leon or Claire, experiencing the initial events from their perspective. Upon completing one scenario, the B scenario unlocked, showing the other character's journey with subtle differences based on the first playthrough's actions. This meant items collected by one character wouldn't be available to the other, and certain events would play out differently. It created a more complete picture of Raccoon City's final days while encouraging multiple playthroughs. Leon's story intertwined with Ada Wong, a mysterious woman claiming to be an FBI agent investigating Umbrella. Their partnership was complicated by Ada's hidden agenda. She was actually a spy sent to retrieve a sample of the G-Virus, Umbrella's newest bioweapon, for a rival organization. Meanwhile, Claire's story connected her with Sherry Birkin, the young daughter of William Birkin, the Umbrella scientist who had created the G-Virus. When Umbrella sent a tactical team to forcibly obtain Birkin's research, he injected himself with the G-Virus in desperation, transforming into a horrifying monster that pursued Sherry throughout the game. The Raccoon City Police Department became the game's primary setting for the first half, a building that, like the Spencer Mansion before it, was filled with puzzles, hidden passages, and environmental storytelling. The precinct had been a museum before becoming a police station, explaining its elaborate architecture and bizarre layout. As players progressed, they descended into the sewers and eventually reached an underground Umbrella laboratory, mirroring the first game's structure while expanding the world significantly. Resident Evil 2 also introduced Mr. X, known as the T-00 Tyrant, an unstoppable bioorganic weapon that relentlessly pursued players through the police station. Unlike most enemies, Mr. X couldn't be permanently killed, only temporarily downed. His heavy footsteps became a source of constant dread, as players never knew when he might burst through a wall or appear around a corner. This stalker enemy type would become a franchise staple, refined and perfected in future entries. The game's climax varied between scenarios, but ultimately converged on the same truth. Umbrella's experiments had doomed Raccoon City. The outbreak began when Umbrella's elite Umbrella security service team botched their mission to retrieve the G-Virus from Birkin. In the chaos, samples of the T-Virus were released, contaminating the city's water supply. Rats spread the infection throughout Raccoon City's population, and within days, the bustling metropolis became a city of the dead. The US government, unable to contain the outbreak, made a terrible decision that would be revealed in the next game. Resident Evil 2 was a massive critical and commercial success, selling over 4.96 million copies on the PlayStation alone and receiving near-universal acclaim. Critics praised its refined gameplay, expanded world, memorable characters, and the ingenious dual scenario system. The game proved Resident Evil wasn't a one-hit wonder. It was a franchise with staying power. Leon and Claire would become series mainstays, appearing in numerous sequels, and the game's influence on horror gaming cannot be overstated. It set the standard for survival horror sequels. Bigger, more complex, but retaining the core elements that made the original work. Resident Evil 3, Nemesis took an interesting structural approach, with its timeline straddling Resident Evil 2. The game opens on September 28, 1998, one day before Leon and Claire's arrival in Raccoon City, and concludes on October 1st, after the city's destruction. Players return to Jill Valentine, one of the original Mansion survivors, as she attempts to escape Raccoon City while being hunted by one of Umbrella's most terrifying creations. The Nemesis T-type, designated Nemesis, was an advanced tyrant programmed with a specific mission: eliminate all surviving STARS members. Unlike Mr. X from Resident Evil 2, who was intimidating but relatively slow and methodical, Nemesis was relentless, fast and equipped with a rocket launcher. He could run, use weapons and pursue Jill through areas that should have been safe. The creature could even follow players through room transitions, something previous Resident Evil enemies couldn't do. His constant presence created an atmosphere of relentless pressure unique in the series. The game introduced several innovations to the formula. A quick dodge mechanic gave players the ability to evade attacks with precise timing, adding a new layer of skill to combat. More importantly, Resident Evil 3 featured the live selection system, occasional moments where players had to make split-second decisions that affected the story's path and available items. These choices weren't always obvious, and making the wrong decision could lead to harder encounters or missed opportunities, encouraging multiple playthroughs to see all possibilities. Jill's escape attempt takes her across more diverse locations than previous games. Burning streets filled with zombies, the Raccoon City tram system, a clock tower, a city park, and eventually a processing plant. She's aided by Carlos Oliveira, a member of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, UBCS, mercenaries hired by Umbrella ostensibly to rescue civilians, but really to gather combat data on BOWs. Carlos was playable during certain sections, providing a refreshing change of pace with his assault rifle and more action-oriented approach. Throughout her escape, Jill repeatedly encounters Nemesis, each confrontation more desperate than the last. The creature mutated throughout the game, becoming more monstrous and aggressive with each defeat. In one of the game's most intense moments, Nemesis infects Jill with the T-virus. Carlos must venture into the Raccoon City hospital to find a vaccine, navigating through hordes of the undead to save her life. This deepened their partnership and added emotional stakes beyond mere survival. The game's climax coincides with the US government's solution to the Raccoon City outbreak: complete sterilization. On October 1st, 1998, a tactical nuclear missile was launched at Raccoon City. Jill and Carlos, along with a handful of other survivors, escape via helicopter moments before the missile impacts, obliterating the city and everything in it. The destruction of Raccoon City was a watershed moment for the franchise. Umbrella's experiments had led directly to the annihilation of an entire American city, killing over 100,000 people. Resident Evil 3 sold well and received positive reviews, though some critics felt it was less revolutionary than its predecessor. The game's action-oriented additions divided fans. Some loved the increased pace and dodge mechanics, while purists felt it strayed from survival horror's core principles. Regardless, Nemesis left an indelible mark on the franchise. The titular creature became one of Resident Evil's most iconic monsters, and the complete destruction of Raccoon City raised the stakes for the entire series. Umbrella could no longer hide behind corporate facades. The whole world now knew something terrible had happened, even if the full truth remained classified. Originally developed for the Sega Dreamcast and released in February 2000, Resident Evil Code. Veronica was positioned as a mainline entry, despite lacking a numerical designation. Many fans consider it the true Resident Evil 3, due to its significance to the overall story and its advancement of series gameplay. The game represented a technological leap, being the first in the franchise to feature fully three-dimensional environments and real-time backgrounds instead of pre-rendered ones, all while maintaining the classic fixed camera angles. Code. Veronica picks up 3 months after the Raccoon City incident, with Claire Redfield still searching for her brother Chris. Her investigation leads her to infiltrate an Umbrella facility in Paris, where she's captured and imprisoned on Rockfort Island, a remote Umbrella prison facility in the Southern Ocean. Just as her situation seems hopeless, an unknown attacker launches an assault on the island, releasing the T-virus and causing yet another outbreak. Claire escapes her cell and teams up with Steve Burnside, a fellow prisoner whose father is an Umbrella employee. The game's story grew increasingly gothic and disturbing as Claire discovered the island's administrator was Alfred Ashford, a mentally unstable young man with an unhealthy obsession with his twin sister Alexia. The Ashford family were Umbrella co-founders who had fallen from grace within the company, and Alfred desperately sought to restore their legacy. The truth was even darker. Alexia had experimented on herself with the T-Veronica virus years earlier, putting herself in cryogenic suspension to safely bond with the virus. Alfred had been maintaining her frozen body while essentially losing his mind, developing a split personality where he believed he was his sister. Halfway through the game, the perspective dramatically shifted to Chris Redfield, finally reuniting players with the original protagonist. After receiving Claire's distress call, Chris infiltrates the Antarctic Umbrella facility where she's been taken. The second half featured Chris fighting through a frozen base while dealing with both BOWs and the freshly awakened Alexia Ashford, now a godlike being wielding fire-based powers thanks to the T-Veronica virus. The reunion between Chris and Claire was touching, and Steve Burnside's tragic transformation and death added genuine emotional weight to the story. But Code. Veronica's most significant contribution was advancing Albert Wesker's story. The former STRS captain, presumed dead since the mansion incident, returned as a primary antagonist. It was revealed that Wesker had infected himself with a prototype virus before his apparent death, granting him superhuman speed, strength, and reflexes. He'd been working behind the scenes, manipulating events for his own mysterious purposes. His confrontations with Chris were spectacular, showing a villain who could move faster than the eye could follow and punch through concrete. Wesker would become the franchise's primary antagonist for the next decade. Code. Veronica was ambitious, weaving together multiple character arcs and revealing crucial backstory about Umbrella's founding families. The game featured longer cutscenes, more complex boss battles, and required players to master both Claire and Chris's unique abilities. However, its Dreamcast exclusivity limited its initial impact. An updated version, code Veronica X, was later ported to PlayStation 2 and GameCube with additional cutscenes further explaining Wesker's survival and motivations. While not as commercially successful as the numbered entries due to platform limitations, it's considered essential to understanding the series' mythology and mark the transition point between Resident Evil's classic era and what would come next. In the early 2000s, Shinji Mikami made a controversial announcement. Resident Evil's future would be exclusive to Nintendo's GameCube. This decision shocked the industry, as PlayStation had been synonymous with the franchise. Capcom and Nintendo had struck a deal that would result in several GameCube-exclusive Resident Evil titles, beginning with a complete remake of the original game and a new prequel, both designed to showcase what the series could achieve with newer hardware. The 2002 Resident Evil remake, often called Remake by fans, redefined what a video game remake could be. Rather than simply updating graphics, the team completely rebuilt the game from the ground up. The Spencer Mansion was more detailed and atmospheric than ever before, with gorgeous pre-rendered backgrounds that looked photorealistic. Real-time lighting effects such as candlelight flickering on walls or lightning illuminating rooms created unprecedented atmosphere. Character models were incredibly detailed and animations were more fluid and realistic. But Remake didn't just improve presentation, it added substantial new content. An entire new area, the Twisted Gardens and Residence building, expanded the mansion significantly. The story was enriched with more backstory about the Umbrella Corporation and the Spencer family. Lisa Trevor, a tragic figure who had been subjected to decades of experiments, became one of the game's most disturbing and sympathetic creatures. Her presence added emotional depth and horror to the mansion's history. The remake also introduced Crimson Heads, an ingenious twist on zombie encounters. Downed zombies, if not properly disposed of by decapitation or burning, would reanimate as faster, more aggressive Crimson Heads. This forced players into resource management dilemmas. Did you use a precious incendiary grenade to prevent a zombie from returning, or conserve ammo and risk facing a more dangerous enemy later? Combined with limited ink ribbons for saving, on higher difficulties, and defense items, like daggers that could break enemy grabs, Remake became the most refined version of classic Resident Evil gameplay. Critics universally praised the remake, calling it one of the greatest video games ever made and the definitive way to experience the original story. However, the GameCube's smaller install base meant sales were modest compared to PlayStation releases. The game would later be ported to other platforms and is now available across multiple generations of consoles, where it has found the wider audience it deserves. Resident Evil 0 and Remake represented the peak of the classic survival horror formula. Fixed cameras, tank controls, limited resources, and exploration-focused gameplay had been refined to near perfection. But the industry was changing. Action games were becoming more popular, and pure survival horror was seen as commercially risky. After the GameCube exclusive era ended earlier than planned, with later titles being ported to other consoles, Capcom faced a decision: continue refining the classic formula, or revolutionize it entirely. Shinji Mikami chose revolution. On January 11, 2005, Resident Evil 4 launched exclusively on GameCube and changed not just its own franchise, but third-person action games forever. Shinji Mikami's team had spent years reimagining what Resident Evil could be, going through multiple complete restarts. One abandoned version became Devil May Cry, Capcom's stylish action franchise. What finally emerged was a game that kept survival horror's tension while dramatically overhauling nearly every gameplay system. The most immediately obvious change was the camera. Gone were the fixed angles and tank controls that had defined the series. In their place was an over-the-shoulder perspective that followed directly behind protagonist Leon S. Kennedy. Players aimed with a laser sight targeting specific body parts to strategically disable enemies. Shooting a cultist's leg might cause them to stumble, allowing Leon to perform a context-sensitive melee attack. Headshots could trigger devastating instant kill animations. Combat became dynamic, skill-based, and intensely satisfying while maintaining resource scarcity that kept encounters tense. The story picked up 6 years after Raccoon City's destruction, in 2004. Leon, no longer a rookie cop but a trained government agent, is sent to rural Spain to rescue Ashley Graham, the US president's daughter, who's been kidnapped by a mysterious cult. What he discovers in the isolated village makes the T-virus seem quaint by comparison. The villagers have been infected with Las Plagas, ancient parasites that grant their host, Osmond Sadler, telepathic control over the infected. Unlike zombies, these ganados retain intelligence, can use weapons and tactics, and communicate with each other. The village setting was a masterstroke. The early hours take place in daytime, a radical departure for the series. Stumbling into the village square to find hostile locals going about their daily routines before they notice you creates visceral unease. The chainsaw-wielding Bella sisters and Salvador became instant icons of horror gaming. The famous village siege, where Leon must survive, waves of ganados until the church bell rings, remains one of gaming's most intense sequences. Later areas, a Gothic castle, industrial facilities and a military island, provided excellent variety while maintaining oppressive atmosphere. Leon wasn't alone on his mission. He was joined by Luis Serra, a former Umbrella researcher seeking redemption, and repeatedly crossed paths with Ada Wong, whose mysterious employers wanted Las Plagas samples. Their dynamic added espionage thriller elements to the horror framework. Ashley Graham, the rescue target, was playable during several sequences and, controversially, had to be protected throughout much of the game. Managing Ashley while fighting enemies added a unique challenge, though her AI could frustrate when it caused her to walk into danger. Albert Wesker returned, pulling strings from behind the scenes and demonstrating his phenomenal powers during one unforgettable sequence where he dodges a barrage of laser fire with contemptuous ease. His agent, Jack Krauser, Leon's former military partner believed dead, appeared as a central antagonist. Krauser had been infected with the control plagas and could transform his arm into massive blades. Their personal rivalry added emotional stakes beyond the mission, culminating in a knife fight that tested everything players had learned. Resident Evil 4 introduced an upgrade system that added light RPG elements. Leon could sell treasures to a mysterious merchant, who appeared throughout the game with his iconic "What are you buying?" greeting, and use the money to upgrade weapons, increase ammo capacity, or purchase new guns. Managing this economy added strategic depth. Should you fully upgrade your starting pistol or save for something more powerful? The attaché case inventory system, where items had to be physically arranged Tetris style, made resource management tactile and engaging. The game was massive, with roughly 15 to 20 hours of content on a first playthrough, far longer than previous entries. It featured incredible boss battles, including a memorable lake monster sequence, multiple encounters with the regenerating Iron Maiden creatures, and the grotesque final confrontation with Sadler's mutated form. Unlockable weapons, costumes, and a separate campaign following Ada's parallel mission, Assignment Ada, later, expanded into separate ways, provided substantial replay value. Critics were nearly unanimous in their praise. Resident Evil 4 received perfect or near-perfect scores across the board and won numerous Game of the Year awards. It sold exceptionally well and was subsequently ported to PlayStation 2, PC, Wii, and essentially every platform released since, eventually selling over 13 million copies across all versions. Its influence rippled across the industry. The over-the-shoulder camera became standard for third-person action games, appearing in everything from Gears of War to The Last of Us. Even games outside the horror genre borrowed its targeting system and dynamic combat philosophy. However, the shift toward action divided the fan base. Purists argued that Resident Evil 4, despite being brilliant, wasn't truly survival horror. Resources were more plentiful, enemies were less frightening when you could kick their heads off, and the gameplay loop prioritized action reflexes over careful exploration. Others embraced the evolution, arguing the game successfully translated survival horror's tension into a more modern framework. This debate would intensify with subsequent entries as Capcom continued down the action path. Resident Evil 4's legacy is indelible. It proved a beloved franchise could completely reinvent itself while retaining its identity. It showed that innovation didn't mean abandoning what made the series special. Tension, atmosphere, and meaningful choices remained despite the dramatic gameplay changes. The game influenced a generation of developers and remains one of the highest regarded action games ever created. It was Resident Evil's Empire Strikes Back moment, a sequel that took risks, expanded the world, and left fans desperate to know what happened next. While the main series was evolving, Capcom experimented with a fascinating spin-off that attempted something unprecedented for survival horror: cooperative online multiplayer. Resident Evil Outbreak and its sequel, File Na 2, released for PlayStation 2 in 2003 and 2004 respectively, took place during the Raccoon City outbreak, running parallel to the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3. Rather than following established heroes, these games focused on ordinary citizens desperately trying to escape the city. Players could choose from 8 unique characters, each with distinct abilities and personal items. Kevin Raymond was a cop with firearms expertise, Mark Wilkins was a security guard who could shove zombies away, Yoko Suzuki had knowledge of medicinal herbs, and so on. The character variety encouraged different approaches to scenarios and fostered team-based strategy. Each scenario began at a specific location: a bar, a zoo, a hospital, the university, and tasked players with navigating through zombie-infested areas to reach an extraction point. The online component was revolutionary for its time, but technically limited by the PS2's network capabilities. Communication options were restricted to simple commands since many players lacked keyboard support or voice chat. The scenarios themselves were excellent, providing glimpses of Raccoon City's final days from perspectives the main games never showed. Outbreak had players escaping from a burning bar, Wild Things explored the city zoo, and The Hive featured time travel elements, and the series' first exploration of Umbrella's origins. Despite innovative concepts, the Outbreak games struggled commercially. The PS2's online infrastructure was still developing, and many players couldn't access the full online experience. The games were playable offline with AI partners, but the computer-controlled allies were frustratingly incompetent, often wasting resources or walking into danger. Additionally, the difficulty was balanced for coordinated human teams, making solo play significantly harder. The servers were eventually shut down in 2011, Though fan communities have worked to restore online functionality, the Outbreak series' canonical status has always been ambiguous. Some scenarios clearly fit into established lore, while others seem to contradict or exist in their own continuity. Capcom has never definitively stated which events are canon. Regardless, the games represented an ambitious experiment in bringing survival horror to the multiplayer space, predating modern cooperative horror games by years. They remain cult favourites among dedicated fans who appreciate their unique approach and the expanded look at Raccoon City's fall. The wait between Resident Evil 4 and 5 was the longest in the franchise's history at that point. When Resident Evil 5 finally launched in March 2009 for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC, it doubled down on the action direction while introducing full cooperative gameplay. The game shifted the setting from Europe to Africa, specifically the fictional Kijuju region, where the BSAA, Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, was investigating Ricardo Irving, an arms dealer selling bioorganic weapons on the black market. Players controlled Chris Redfield, now a hulking, muscle-bound BSAA veteran, partnered with Shiva Alomar, a BSAA agent with personal connections to the region. The cooperative gameplay was mandatory. Whether playing online with another human or offline with an AI partner, every moment of the campaign featured both characters. This fundamentally changed the experience. Puzzles required coordination, with characters splitting up to manipulate switches or provide covering fire. Resource sharing became crucial, as health items and ammunition had to be distributed between partners. The Las Plagas parasites returned, but now they were being developed and distributed by Tricell, a pharmaceutical corporation that had acquired much of Umbrella's research after its collapse. The Majini, Swahili for evil spirit, locals infected with enhanced Plagas variants, served as the primary enemies. Like the Ganados before them, they retained intelligence and could coordinate attacks, though now players had a partner to watch their backs. Resident Evil 5's story brought Albert Wesker's arc to its conclusion. His plan was apocalyptic in scope: release Ouroboros, a virus that would kill billions while transforming a select few into superhuman beings, creating a new world order with Wesker as a god. The game revealed more about Umbrella's origins through Spencer's involvement and the twisted eugenics philosophy that had driven the company from the beginning. Wesker's obsession with creating a superior human race through viral engineering represented everything Umbrella stood for taken to its ultimate extreme. The climactic battle against Wesker in an active volcano was spectacular, over the top, and very much in the spirit of action cinema. Chris and Shiva's teamwork was essential to finally putting down the superhuman tyrant. Jill Valentine's return, having been brainwashed by Wesker and forced to serve as his enforcer before being freed, provided an emotional high point and a boss battle against a beloved character. Wesker's death marked the end of an era. The franchise's primary villain since the beginning was finally gone. Critical reception was positive but more mixed than RE4. The graphics, set pieces and cooperative gameplay received praise. However, several aspects drew criticism. The African setting, combined with predominantly black infected enemies, sparked controversy about racial insensitivity. Though the developers maintained they never intended any racist undertones and simply wanted to explore a different region. The AI partner could be problematic in solo play, sometimes wasting ammunition or healing items at inappropriate times. More fundamentally, many felt Resident Evil 5 had abandoned survival horror entirely. Resources were plentiful, especially in cooperative play where players could share supplies. The partner system meant you were never alone or vulnerable, removing much of the isolation that defined horror games. The setting, while visually striking, often featured bright daylight, further diminishing horror atmosphere. Action set pieces like driving sequences and turret sections felt more like Call of Duty than classic Resident Evil. Despite these criticisms, Resident Evil 5 was commercially massive, becoming Capcom's best-selling game at the time with over 7.9 million copies sold, eventually surpassing 13 million. The cooperative gameplay, while divisive among survival horror fans, attracted a broader audience who enjoyed action games. Mercenaries Mode, an arcade-style challenge where players fought waves of enemies for high scores, became incredibly popular and was expanded significantly. The game proved Resident Evil could succeed as an action franchise, but it also made clear that Capcom needed to decide what the series' identity truly was. Between mainline entries, Capcom released 2 light gun-style games for the Wii that served as interactive retrospectives of the series' history. Resident Evil, The Umbrella Chronicles 2007, and The Dark Side Chronicles 2009 retold events from multiple games while filling in narrative gaps with new scenarios. Umbrella Chronicles covered Resident Evil 0, the original game, and Resident Evil 3, while adding entirely new scenarios like Umbrella's End, which detailed the BSAA's assault on Umbrella's last remaining facility in Russia in 2003, finally showing the corporation's complete collapse. Darkside Chronicles retold Resident Evil 2 and Code, Veronica while introducing Operation Javier, a mission Leon and Krauser undertook in South America in 2002 that explained their relationship before RE4. These games served important archival functions, making classic stories accessible to players who hadn't experienced the original games. The on-rails format meant they weren't traditional Resident Evil experiences, but they respected the source material while adding context. The scenarios filling narrative gaps proved especially valuable, showing events that had previously only been mentioned in files or supplementary material. Both games were later ported to PlayStation 3 in the Chronicles HD collection, though they lost some of their appeal without the Wii's motion controls that simulated light gun gameplay. Between the main action-heavy entries, Capcom tested a return to survival horror roots with Resident Evil Revelations, released for Nintendo 3DS in 2012. Set in 2005 between Resident Evil 4 and 5, the game followed Jill Valentine and Parker Luciani as they investigated the Queen Zenobia, a supposedly abandoned cruise ship in the Mediterranean Sea. The vessel, drifting mysteriously, became infested with ooze, BOWs created from humans exposed to the T-Abyss virus in aquatic environments. The game's structure was episodic, divided into chapters that switched between multiple character pairs and time periods, slowly revealing a conspiracy involving the terrorist organization Veltro and corruption within the BSAA itself. The confined ship setting evoked classic Resident Evil, with limited resources, cramped corridors, and genuinely disturbing enemy designs. The ooze emerge from pools of water and ooze through vents, creating constant tension about where they might appear. Revelations introduced a scanning mechanic using a device called the Genesis, which allowed players to scan environments for hidden items and analyze enemies for biological data. Completing scans filled a meter that rewarded players with herbs, creating an interesting risk-reward dynamic. Do you take time to thoroughly scan an area, potentially alerting enemies, or push forward with what you have? The customizable weapon system let players add modifications to firearms, adjusting stats like firepower, capacity, and firing rate. The game was praised for balancing horror atmosphere with modern gameplay sensibilities. While it featured segments with Chris and his partner Jessica that leaned more action-heavy, Jill's sections aboard the Queen Zenobia delivered genuine survival horror tension. The graphics were impressive for handheld hardware, and when the game was later ported to consoles and PC with enhanced visuals, it found an even wider audience. Revelation's success led to Resident Evil Revelations 2, released episodically in early 2015. This sequel followed Claire Redfield and Barry Burton's daughter, Moira, as they were kidnapped and imprisoned on an isolated island facility. The game featured split-screen cooperative gameplay with unique character dynamics. Claire wielded firearms while Moira, traumatized and unable to use guns, relied on a crowbar and flashlight that could blind enemies. Similarly, Barry partnered with Natalia Corder, a young girl who could sense enemies through walls, creating an interesting support dynamic. Revelations 2's episodic structure included 2 timelines running concurrently: Claire and Moira's present-day imprisonment, and Barry searching for them 6 months later alongside Natalia. The narrative wove between these perspectives, with the earlier timeline's choices affecting later events. The story delved into philosophical territory, with antagonist Alex Wesker, Albert's sister, another Wesker Project subject, seeking immortality through consciousness transfer, exploring themes of identity and what truly makes someone human. Both Revelations games demonstrated that Resident Evil could still deliver horror-focused experiences in the modern era. They proved there was an audience for slower-paced, resource-scarce gameplay alongside the blockbuster action entries. The game's success planted seeds for Capcom's eventual full-scale return to the series' roots, showing that survival horror wasn't commercially dead. It just needed the right approach. Resident Evil 6 was Capcom's most ambitious and polarizing entry, a game that tried to be everything to everyone and, in trying to please all audiences, ended up dividing the fanbase more than any title before or since. Released in October 2012, it featured the largest budget and scope in the series, with 4 distinct campaigns, multiple playable characters, and a story that spanned the globe. The game structure allowed players to choose from 4 campaigns, each with a different gameplay focus and tone. Leon Kennedy's campaign, set in the fictional American city of Tall Oaks, harkened back to Resident Evil 2 with slower-paced horror exploring zombie-infested streets and buildings. Chris Redfield's campaign in the war-torn nation of Edonia was pure military action, with his BSAA squad battling Javo, humans infected with the C-virus who could mutate mid-combat. Jake Muller, Wesker's previously unknown son, and Sherry Birkin's campaign mixed action with stealth, focusing on their escape from various pursuers. Ada Wong's campaign, unlocked after completing the others, tied everything together from her espionage perspective. The story involved global bioterrorism on an unprecedented scale. The Family, a secret organization manipulating world events, unleashed bioterrorist attacks across multiple continents to accelerate viral evolution and create the perfect bioweapon. Derek Simmons, a high-ranking government official secretly heading the Family, had unleashed the C-virus in Tall Oaks to cover up the truth about Raccoon City and silence the president, who planned to reveal the government's complicity in Umbrella's crimes. Resident Evil 6 introduced sweeping changes to gameplay. Players could now move while shooting, dive in any direction, perform melee combos, and execute context-sensitive finishes. Cover mechanics, quick-time events, and dramatic camera angles during action sequences became frequent. Stamina meters limited melee attacks, and a tablet interface managed inventory on the fly. The game pursued cinematic spectacle aggressively, with helicopter chases, underwater sequences, vehicle sections, and massive set pieces that belonged more in an Uncharted game than classic Resident Evil. Critical reception was notably mixed. While some reviewers praised the scope, cooperative gameplay, and varied campaign experiences, many criticized the game for being bloated, unfocused, and too far removed from survival horror. The campaign length, roughly 20-25 hours across all 4 stories, felt padded with repetitive encounters and unnecessary quick-time events. The inventory system was clumsy, healing required poorly explained tablets, and the camera frequently struggled during intense action. More fundamentally, fans questioned what Resident Evil even meant anymore. Was it horror, action, military shooter? The answer seemed to be all of the above, but that lack of focus made RE6 feel like 4 different games stitched together. Leon's campaign showed what horror-focused RE could be, while Chris's campaign often felt indistinguishable from generic third-person shooters. The tone whiplash was jarring, especially when characters acted comedically in one scene and dealt with catastrophic tragedy in the next. Despite mixed reviews, Resident Evil 6 sold exceptionally well initially, shipping 4.5 million copies in its first month. However, word of mouth was less enthusiastic than RE5, and while it eventually sold over 11 million copies across all platforms, it was viewed internally at Capcom as underperforming given its massive development costs and marketing push. The game's reception prompted serious reflection within Capcom about the franchise's direction. Something had to change. Following RE6's divisive reception, Capcom entered a period of uncertainty about Resident Evil's identity. Several experimental titles released during this time with varying degrees of success, testing different approaches and genres. Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City 2012, developed by Slant 6 Games, was a squad-based tactical shooter that asked, what if we played as Umbrella's villains? The game featured a USS, Umbrella Security Service team, sent into Raccoon City to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses, including canonical heroes. The concept was intriguing, seeing events from the antagonist's perspective, but execution was poor. Clunky controls, uninspired level design, and forgettable gameplay resulted in harsh critical reviews. The game's what-if scenarios where players could kill Leon or Claire felt like cheap gimmicks rather than meaningful alternate history. Umbrella Corps, 2016, attempted to create a competitive multiplayer Resident Evil experience, pitting teams against each other in zombie-filled arenas. Players used zombie jammers to avoid aggravating the undead while fighting enemy teams. The concept had potential, but poor balance, limited content and a tiny player base killed the game quickly. It's widely considered one of the worst entries in the franchise, forgotten almost immediately after release. Between these misfires came Resident Evil Resistance 2020, an asymmetrical multiplayer game where 4 survivors attempted to escape scenarios designed in real time by a 5th player controlling security systems, traps, and monsters. Similar to Dead by Daylight, Resistance showed promise with its creative premise and direct ties to RE3 Remake's Umbrella experiments. However, balance issues, limited map variety, and being overshadowed by the RE3 remake it launched, prevented it from finding a lasting audience. These experimental titles reflected Capcom's struggle to find Resident Evil's place in the modern market. Multiplayer shooters and live service games dominated the industry, and Resident Evil seemed to lack a clear identity beyond the franchise that used to be about survival horror. The answer to this identity crisis would come from an unexpected direction: virtual reality and a complete reinvention of what Resident Evil could be. On January 24, 2017, Resident Evil 7, Biohazard launched and shocked the gaming world by successfully reinventing the franchise once again. After years of action-heavy entries, Capcom made the bold decision to strip everything back to basics. One protagonist, a single location, limited resources, and overwhelming horror. The game was built on the newly developed RE engine, which would become Capcom's flagship technology, powering all their major releases going forward. The shift to first-person perspective was controversial when first revealed. Resident Evil had always been third-person, and many worried the change would make it feel less like Resident Evil. Those fears were quickly dispelled once players experienced the game. First-person intensified the horror immeasurably. Every corner turned felt more personal, every encounter more immediate. The game supported PlayStation VR, making it the first major horror game designed for virtual reality, creating an almost unbearably terrifying experience for those brave enough to try it. The story followed Ethan Winters, a completely ordinary civilian searching for his wife Mia, who'd been missing for 3 years. Her cryptic message led him to a derelict plantation in Louisiana's bayou, where he discovered the Baker family: Jack, Marguerite, Lucas, and the elderly grandma living in squalor and murderous insanity. The early hours echoed horror classics like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Evil Dead, with Ethan being captured, forced to participate in a grotesque dinner, and hunted through the decaying mansion by the seemingly indestructible Jack Baker. What made the Bakers terrifying was their humanity twisted by infection. Jack Baker, particularly, was a tragic figure, a family man driven mad and turned into a monster, yet glimpses of his former self occasionally surfaced. Marguerite's insect-themed horror and Lucas's sadistic, Saw-inspired death traps added variety to the threats. The setting, a claustrophobic plantation house filled with mold, decay, and body horror, evoked the Spencer Mansion's oppressive atmosphere while feeling completely fresh. The truth behind the horror involved Evelyn, a bioweapon created to be the perfect infiltrator. A young girl who could control minds and spread a fungus-based infection called the mold. The organization that created her, the Connections, represented bioweapons development continuing in Umbrella's absence. Evelyn's desire for a family had led her to infect the Bakers and force them into a twisted parody of normalcy. Mia had been transporting Evelyn when things went catastrophically wrong, leading to the entire nightmare. Gameplay returned to the series' survival horror roots with a vengeance. Resources were scarce, forcing careful ammunition management and strategic decisions about when to fight versus flee. Puzzles required exploration and observation. Safe rooms with save points and item boxes returned. The mansion could be explored non-linearly, with keys and items opening new paths in classic Metroidvania fashion. Boss battles emphasize pattern recognition and resource conservation rather than spectacle. Critical reception was overwhelmingly positive. Reviewers praised the return to horror, the oppressive atmosphere, clever design, and successful first-person perspective. The game earned numerous awards and quickly sold over 10 million copies, proving that survival horror wasn't just viable, it was profitable. Fans who had felt alienated by RE6's direction welcomed the return to the franchise's roots, though some missed the series' established characters and clearer connections to previous lore. Resident Evil 7 also demonstrated Capcom's commitment to post-launch support. Free and paid DLC expanded the experience significantly. Not a Hero followed Chris Redfield as he infiltrated the Baker plantation to capture Lucas, tying events more directly into the wider RE universe. End of Zoe showed Zoe Baker's rescue by her Uncle Joe, a wild man who punched monsters to death in gloriously over-the-top fashion. Banned footage volumes delivered additional horror scenarios exploring Lucas's traps and the Baker family's history, RE7 proved Resident Evil could be reinvented while honouring its core identity. By stripping away decades of accumulated lore and focusing on pure horror, Capcom reminded everyone why the franchise mattered in the first place. It set the template for the series' modern era. Grounded horror, resource management, environmental storytelling, and willingness to take creative risks. The stage was set for Resident Evil's next evolution, building on RE7's foundation while expanding its scope. Released on May 7, 2021, Resident Evil Village built directly on RE7's foundation, while dramatically expanding its scope and ambition. Marketed as Resident Evil 7 Part 2 during development, and subtitled Village, with the Roman numeral 8 hidden in the title, the game continued Ethan Winters' story while blending first-person horror with Resident Evil 4-style action and a gothic fairy tale aesthetic unlike anything the series had attempted before. Set 3.5 years after RE7 in February 2021, the game opened with Ethan and Mia living quietly in Europe under BSAA protection with their infant daughter Rosemary. This domestic tranquility shattered violently when Chris Redfield stormed their home, apparently murdered Mia, and kidnapped both Ethan and Rose. Ethan awakens in a mysterious Eastern European village surrounded by mountains, snow, and werewolf-like creatures called lichens. His singular goal: find his daughter and understand what's happening. The village setting was extraordinary. Unlike RE7's single location, Village featured an interconnected hub area from which players could access 4 distinct regions, each ruled by one of Mother Miranda's lords. Lady Alcina Dimitrescu and her vampiric daughters inhabited Castle Dimitrescu, a gothic masterpiece filled with wine cellars, torture chambers, and art galleries. Donna Beneviento's house delivered pure psychological horror through hallucinogenic plants and possessed dolls, including the terrifying Angie. Salvatore Moreau's Reservoir was a body horror nightmare filled with aquatic monsters. Karl Heisenberg's Factory combined industrial horror with Magneto-like electromagnetic powers and a mechanized army. Each area had distinct gameplay and atmosphere. Castle Dimitrescu evoked classic Resident Evil with intricate exploration, limited resources, and the constantly stalking Lady Dimitrescu, whose 9-foot 6-inch height and imposing presence made Mr. X seem small. The Beneviento house stripped away Ethan's weapons entirely, forcing players through a first-person horror experience reminiscent of PT. Moreau's Reservoir emphasized environmental hazards and grotesque creature designs. Heisenberg's Factory leaned into action with more enemies and heavier weapons, culminating in a boss fight piloting a metal-shredding tank. The game's mythology delved into the series' deepest lore. Mother Miranda, the village's dark priestess, had discovered the mold fungus, called the megamycete, in a cave beneath the village after losing her daughter Eva to Spanish flu in 1919. Her experiments over a century had created the Kadu parasites that transformed her lords, and she'd been manipulating events behind the scenes of the entire franchise. Spencer, Umbrella's founder, had been her student before creating his own viral research empire. Miranda sought to resurrect her daughter by finding the perfect vessel, and Rosemary, born with traces of mold from Ethan's previous infection, was ideal. The game balanced horror and action masterfully. Early hours were terrifying, with limited ammunition and overwhelming enemies creating constant tension. As Ethan upgraded weapons and abilities through the Duke, a mysterious merchant even larger than the RE4 vendor, he became more capable, shifting the power dynamic while maintaining challenge. Boss battles were spectacular, especially the final confrontation with a mutated Heisenberg in his factory and the climactic battle against Miranda's monstrous true form. Village's biggest narrative twist came in its final act. Ethan had actually died during RE7's events, killed by Jack Baker early on. The mold infection had resurrected him and kept him functioning, essentially making him a molded creature like the monsters he'd fought. This revelation recontextualized both games, explaining his superhuman endurance and ability to reattach severed limbs with first aid spray. In the end, Ethan sacrificed himself to destroy Miranda and save Rose, detonating a bomb that obliterated the village while Chris and the BSAA evacuated with his daughter. The epilogue jumped forward years, showing a teenage Rosemary being driven somewhere by what appears to be a BSAA agent, setting up future story possibilities. Additional story content, Shadows of Rose, released later as DLC, would explore Rose's abilities and the lingering effects of mold infection in a surreal nightmare realm representing her subconscious. Critics universally praised Village, calling it one of the best entries in the franchise. The game perfectly balanced horror and action, featured memorable characters and locations, and told a cohesive story, while expanding series mythology significantly. Lady Dimitrescu became a cultural phenomenon, trending worldwide and generating endless memes and fan art. The game sold exceptionally well, shipping 3 million copies in its first 4 days, and eventually exceeding 10 million sales. Resident Evil Village proved the series had found its modern identity. The first-person perspective worked brilliantly for horror and action alike. The RE engine delivered stunning visuals and performance. Most importantly, Capcom had learned to balance fan service with innovation, creating experiences that felt fresh while honouring the franchise's legacy. While Capcom developed new entries, they simultaneously embarked on an ambitious project, comprehensively remaking the classic games that defined the franchise. These weren't simple graphical updates or ports. They were complete reimaginings built from the ground up on the RE engine, modernizing gameplay while respecting the original experiences. Released on January 25, 2019, the Resident Evil 2 remake was a masterclass in how to update a beloved classic. The team studied the original game religiously, understanding what made it special before deciding what to change and what to preserve. The result perfectly captured the spirit of the 1998 original, while playing like a modern survival horror game. The most obvious change was the perspective shift from fixed cameras to over-the-shoulder third person, similar to RE4 but with slower, more methodical pacing. This maintained the claustrophobic tension while allowing more environmental detail and atmospheric lighting. The Raccoon City Police Department was rebuilt room by room, maintaining the original's layout while adding incredible detail. Blood-stained walls told stories of desperate last stands, scattered notes from officers revealed their final moments, and environmental clues guided exploration. Both Leon and Claire's scenarios were fully realized, though the second-run scenarios were streamlined compared to the original's complex A-B system. Mr. X's implementation was particularly brilliant. While he appeared in the original's B scenarios, the remake gave him much more presence, stalking players relentlessly through the police station. His heavy footsteps becoming audible from multiple rooms away created constant dread. You'd be solving a puzzle when those footsteps would start growing louder, forcing a decision: hide, run, or waste ammunition, temporarily stopping him. Boss battles were reimagined with modern design sensibilities while maintaining their original spirit. William Birkin's multiple mutations were more horrifying than ever, each form emphasizing different tactics. The final battle against Super Tyrant in the laboratory was appropriately climactic. Even the alligator sequence returned, with a new twist that made it more interactive and thrilling. The remake sold phenomenally well, becoming Capcom's fastest-selling game at launch, and going on to move over 13 million copies, making it the best-selling Resident Evil game of all time and the best-selling survival horror title ever. Critical reception was exceptional, with many calling it the definitive survival horror experience. It demonstrated that classic game design could work in the modern era when executed with care and respect for the source material. Riding RE2 Remake's success, Capcom released the Resident Evil 3 remake on April 3, 2020. While also excellent, RE3 Remake was noticeably more action-oriented and streamlined compared to both its predecessor and the original 1999 game. The game compressed the original's more open structure into a tighter, more linear experience, focusing on Nemesis as a constant, overwhelming threat. Nemesis himself was terrifying, appearing more frequently and aggressively than in the original. The creature could sprint at full speed, use weapons including a flamethrower, and corner players with frightening intelligence. Set-piece encounters with Nemesis were spectacular. A downtown battle that demolished buildings, a rooftop chase ending with the monster impaled on a tower, and multiple transformations that made each encounter feel distinct. However, the remake drew criticism for cutting content from the original. The clock tower section was significantly reduced, the Gravedigger boss was removed entirely, and the branching path choices were simplified or eliminated. The game was noticeably shorter than RE2 Remake, completable in 6 to 8 hours compared to 10-15 hours for its predecessor. Some fans felt these cuts diminished what made RE3 special, though others appreciated the tighter pacing. What the remake did include was executed brilliantly. Carlos Oliveira's sections provided excellent pacing changes, his assault rifle-focused gameplay contrasting effectively with Jill's more measured approach. The hospital sequence, where Carlos searched for a vaccine while Jill was infected, was genuinely terrifying. The remake also fleshed out Jill and Carlos's relationship, giving both characters more personality and development than the original. RE3 Remake launched alongside Resident Evil Resistance. The asymmetrical multiplayer game included as a separate mode. While Resistance had potential, it never achieved the popularity Capcom hoped for, overshadowed by the single-player campaign most players purchased the game for. The remake sold well, moving over 8 million copies, though it didn't achieve RE2 Remake's cultural impact or longevity. Released on March 24, 2023, the Resident Evil 4 Remake faced unique challenges. The original was already considered one of the greatest games ever made, still played, and beloved by millions. How do you remake perfection? Capcom's answer was to modernize the experience while maintaining its core appeal, refining rather than revolutionizing. The remake retained RE4's structure and pacing while grounding it in a darker, more serious tone. The campy humor was dialed back, though not eliminated, cheese was reduced, and Leon's personality was more consistent with his portrayal in other modern entries, competent and skilled, but not invincible. Ashley was significantly improved as a character and companion, with better AI and more agency in her own rescue. The castle and island sections were expanded and rebalanced, addressing complaints that the original's second half didn't quite match its village opening. Gameplay modernizations included a parrying system that rewarded skilled timing, stealth mechanics allowing quieter approaches, and more complex encounters that demanded tactical thinking. The attaché case inventory returned with enhancements, weapon customization was deeper, and the merchant offered more meaningful choices. Village sieges and set pieces were redesigned to be more dynamic, often providing multiple approach strategies rather than single solutions. The game addressed one of the original's most criticized aspects, the escort mission with Ashley. Her AI was vastly improved. She could hide in designated lockers during combat, and the formation system let Leon direct her movement more precisely. What was once frustrating became manageable, even enjoyable at times, as Ashley became a character to protect rather than a burden to drag along. Critics showered the remake with praise, many calling it superior to the original while acknowledging the audacity of that claim. Sales were phenomenal, with over 3 million copies sold in the first 2 days, reaching 4 million within 2 weeks. It became one of the fastest-selling Resident Evil games, and demonstrated once again that Capcom had mastered the remake formula. Respect the original, modernize what needs updating, and deliver an experience that feels both familiar and fresh. The remake series revitalized interest in Resident Evil's classic era. Younger players who'd only experienced the first-person entries could now experience the stories that defined survival horror. Longtime fans could revisit beloved games with modern sensibilities. Each remake proved that good game design transcends eras. When executed properly, these 20-plus-year-old experiences could compete with, and even surpass modern releases. At the heart of Resident Evil's enduring appeal lies its intricate mythology of bioweapons research and corporate conspiracy. The franchise's various viruses and parasites aren't just plot devices. They're carefully developed concepts that ground the horror in pseudoscientific plausibility, making the impossible feel terrifyingly real. The T-virus, short for Tyrant Virus, was the foundation of Umbrella's bioweapons program. Originally derived from the progenitor virus discovered by Umbrella's founders in West Africa, the T-virus was designed to create controllable bioorganic weapons. However, its effects proved difficult to manage. When humans were infected, the virus typically killed them and reanimated the corpse as a zombie, mindless, aggressive, and driven by instinct to feed. The virus also affected animals and plants, creating mutated creatures like Cerberus dogs, crows, and various plant-based horrors. The perfect T-virus BOW was the Tyrant, a humanoid creature with immense strength, speed, and durability. Creating a Tyrant required specific genetic compatibility, making them rare but devastatingly effective. The T-02 from the first game represented the culmination of Mansion research, while later variants like Mr. X and Nemesis refined the concept with increased intelligence and controllability. The G-virus, created by William Birkin, represented evolution beyond the T-virus. Where T-virus created relatively stable mutations, the G-virus caused continuous, rapid mutation. Birkin's self-injection during Resident Evil 2 demonstrated both its power and instability. He transformed through 5 increasingly grotesque forms, each adaptation occurring in response to damage. The G-virus could also implant embryos in hosts, creating more G-creatures, though most humans rejected the parasite violently. Las Plagas, the parasites from Resident Evil 4, represented a different approach entirely. These ancient organisms, sealed beneath a Spanish castle for centuries, didn't kill hosts, but rather controlled them. The parasite would grow in the host's body, eventually emerging to exert direct control. Unlike zombies, Plagas-infected individuals retained their intelligence and could coordinate complex tactics, making them far more dangerous in combat situations. The Ouroboros virus from Resident Evil 5 was Wesker's attempt at forced evolution. Most humans infected with Ouroboros died immediately, their bodies becoming black, writhing masses of tentacles. Only those with specific genetic markers could survive infection and gain superhuman abilities. Wesker's vision involved releasing Ouroboros globally, killing billions but transforming the genetically worthy into a new, superior species. The C virus from Resident Evil 6 combined various viral strains, creating Javo, infected humans that could mutate specific body parts mid-combat in response to damage. This adaptive evolution made them unpredictable and challenging, as a Javo might grow armor plating where shot or develop flight capability if tactical advantage was needed. The mold from Resident Evil 7 and Village represented yet another paradigm. This fungal organism, technically the megamycete, could preserve consciousness, control hosts, and create sentient bioweapons like Eveline. Unlike viruses that corrupted biology, the mold seemed almost alive, a collective intelligence that could share memories and experiences across its connected organisms. This made it both fascinating from a scientific perspective and deeply unsettling from a horror standpoint. Beyond the bioweapons themselves, Resident Evil's mythology includes the corporations and organizations that create and control them. Umbrella Corporation was the franchise's original antagonist, a pharmaceutical company that used its legitimate business as cover for illegal bioweapons development. Founded by Oswell E. Spencer, Dr. James Marcus, and Edward Ashford, Umbrella's true goal was never profit, but rather Spencer's eugenic vision of creating a superior race of humans. After Umbrella's collapse following the Raccoon City incident and subsequent investigations, its research didn't disappear, it proliferated. Rival corporations like Troicell acquired Umbrella's data and continued bioweapons development. The Family, a shadow organization influencing world governments, pursued viral research for their own ends. The Connections created Evelyn and the E-Series bioweapons. These entities ensured that even with Umbrella gone, bioterrorism remained a global threat requiring agencies, like the BSAA, to combat it constantly. This mythology provides more than just background. It creates moral complexity. Not every Umbrella employee was evil. Many researchers believed they were developing legitimate medical treatments. The tragedy of characters like William Birkin, who sought scientific achievement and became monsters, adds pathos to the horror. Organizations like the BSAA operate in morally grey areas, sometimes employing former villains or using questionable methods to combat bioterrorism. The science, while fictional, is grounded enough to feel plausible. Viruses do mutate hosts, parasites do control behavior, fungi can form networked consciousness. Resident Evil extrapolates from real biology into nightmare territory, making us question how far humanity might go in pursuit of power. This grounding elevates the franchise beyond simple monster stories into explorations of scientific hubris, corporate greed, and the thin line between advancement and atrocity. Resident Evil's influence extends far beyond video games into a multimedia empire that has shaped horror entertainment across multiple mediums. The live-action film series, beginning with 2002's Resident Evil, starring Milla Jovovich as original character Alice, became one of the highest-grossing video game adaptations ever. Despite receiving generally negative reviews from critics and mixed reactions from game fans for deviating heavily from source material, the 6-film series grossed over $1.2 billion globally. Paul W.S. Anderson's films created their own continuity, loosely inspired by game elements, but telling an original story focused on Alice's superhuman battles against Umbrella Corporation and various viral outbreaks. The films became increasingly action-heavy and visually spectacular, eventually featuring Alice gaining psychic powers and leading a resistance against an AI-controlling umbrella. While purists dismissed them, the movies introduced Resident Evil to audiences who might never have played the games, expanding the franchise's cultural footprint significantly. A reboot, Resident Evil: Welcome to Raccoon City 2021, attempted a more faithful adaptation of the first two games. Directed by Johannes Roberts, it combined elements from both Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2, set during the mansion incident and Raccoon City outbreak. While closer to the game's tone and structure, it received mixed reviews and modest box office returns, suggesting audiences had grown attached to the Anderson film's approach, despite their liberties. In 2022, Netflix released a live-action series set in a timeline where Umbrella's pharmaceutical research continued openly after Raccoon City, following Albert Wesker's daughters navigating their father's secrets in both 2022 and a 2036 post-apocalyptic timeline. The show was cancelled after one season due to poor reviews and low viewership, struggling to balance RE lore with its original storyline. More successful were the CGI animated films that maintained game continuity. Resident Evil Degeneration 2008, Resident Evil Damnation 2012, Resident Evil Vendetta 2017, and Resident Evil Death Island 2023 featured game characters like Leon, Claire, Chris, and Jill in canon adventures bridging the main games. These films delved into bioterrorism incidents that, while not essential to the main storyline, enriched the world and character relationships. Their anime aesthetic and faithful treatment of game lore made them popular with dedicated fans. Resident Evil Infinite Darkness, a Netflix CGI series released in 2021, followed Leon and Claire investigating a conspiracy involving viral bioweapons in the White House and China. Its 4 episodes bridged events between games while exploring the political dimensions of bioterrorism in the RE universe. The franchise's cultural influence on horror gaming cannot be overstated. Resident Evil defined survival horror as a genre, establishing conventions that countless games have followed. Limited resources creating tension, environmental storytelling through documents and scenery, safe rooms providing respite, and vulnerability being more frightening than empowerment. Games like Silent Hill, Dead Space, The Evil Within, Outlast, and Amnesia all owe debts to Resident Evil's pioneering design. Beyond gaming, Resident Evil contributed significantly to the zombie renaissance of the 2000s and 2010s. According to multiple creators, the franchise's popularity helped greenlight films like 28 Days Later, the Dawn of the Dead remake, and eventually the Walking Dead television series. Edgar Wright credited Resident Evil 2 as inspiration for Shaun of the Dead. George A. Romero himself acknowledged the game's role in revitalizing interest in zombie media for a new generation. The franchise's visual language, the green herb healing item, the typewriters and item boxes, the specific design of the T-Virus and Umbrella Corporation logo has become iconic in popular culture, instantly recognizable even to those who haven't played the games. Lady Dimitrescu from Village became a viral sensation, trending worldwide and spawning endless fan creations. Characters like Leon, Jill, and Chris have become video game icons whose designs and personalities have influenced character creation across the industry. Resident Evil merchandise spans action figures, clothing, replicas, board games, and escape rooms. The franchise has inspired theme park attractions at Universal Studios, restaurant collaborations in Japan, and has sold over 170 million copies across all games as of 2025, making it Capcom's best-selling franchise and among the highest-grossing horror franchises across all media. On June 6, 2025, at the State of Play presentation, Capcom revealed Resident Evil Requiem RE9 with a cinematic trailer and confirmed a February 27, 2026 release date. The 9th main entry returns the series to Raccoon City, not as players remember it, but as it exists in the present day, decades after its nuclear destruction. According to developers, they initially believed they couldn't touch Raccoon City after it had been so thoroughly explored and destroyed, but eventually found a compelling reason to return. While full details remain scarce, Capcom has confirmed RE9 will continue the first-person perspective established in RE7 and Village, built on the RE engine. The game promises to explore the long-term aftermath of bioterrorism, questioning what happens to a location after cataclysmic viral outbreak and governmental cover-up. Will survivors who've lived in the shadows come forward? What lingered in the ruins all these years? How has the landscape changed both physically and politically? Speculation suggests the game might feature Rosemary Winters as protagonist or co-protagonist, given Village's epilogue showing her as a teenager being driven by what appears to be a BSAA agent. Her unique abilities as a mold-infected individual could provide fresh gameplay mechanics while connecting to the series' recent mythology. However, Capcom could equally introduce new protagonists to provide fresh perspectives on the franchise's most infamous location. The choice to return to Raccoon City is symbolic. After years of globe-trotting adventures and increasingly outlandish bioterror threats, coming back to where it all went wrong suggests Resident Evil might be exploring its roots more thoughtfully. The location holds such emotional weight for longtime fans that any return must justify itself narratively and thematically. What story could only be told in Raccoon City's ruins? What truth has been buried there? These questions drive speculation until more information releases. Beyond RE9, Capcom has demonstrated continued commitment to the franchise across multiple formats. The RE engine continues powering both new entries and remakes, with fans wondering which classic game might receive the remake treatment next. Code. Veronica seems likely given its narrative importance, and the fact that every numbered entry through 4 has now been remade. Resident Evil 0, or the original game's remake, could potentially receive RE engine updates, though remaking a remake presents unique challenges. VR continues to be a focus, with Resident Evil Village receiving a PlayStation VR 2 version that many consider the definitive way to experience the game. The technology has advanced significantly since RE7's VR implementation, suggesting future entries might be designed with VR as a primary rather than optional experience. The immersion and terror VR provides aligns perfectly with survival horror's goals. Multiplayer experiments continue, though with mixed results. After Resistance and Reverse failed to gain traction, Capcom seems to understand that RE's strength lies in carefully crafted single-player or small-scale cooperative experiences rather than competitive live service models. Future multiplayer attempts, if any, would benefit from studying Revelation's raid mode or Mercenaries' score attack format. Structured challenges that complement rather than replace the single-player focus. The franchise's legacy is secure, its influence undeniable, and its future looks bright. From a single mansion in 1996 to a global multimedia empire, Resident Evil has survived and thrived by understanding a fundamental truth. Horror comes from vulnerability, uncertainty, and the terrible things humanity creates in pursuit of power. As long as Capcom remembers these principles, Resident Evil will continue terrifying and captivating audiences for generations to come. As we close this comprehensive journey through Resident Evil's history, from the Spencer Mansion to mysterious European villages and back to Raccoon City's radioactive ruins, one truth becomes clear. Resident Evil succeeded by constantly evolving while never forgetting its core identity. Whether through fixed cameras or first-person perspectives, whether facing zombies or parasites, the franchise has always asked players to survive against overwhelming odds with limited resources and fraying nerves. The series has given us unforgettable moments. That first zombie turning to face us, Nemesis smashing through a wall, regenerating Ganados, Lady Dimitrescu stalking her castle halls. It's given us complex characters who've grown across decades, from rookie cops to legendary soldiers, from scared siblings to supernatural daughters. It's created a mythology of corporate evil and scientific hubris that feels uncomfortably plausible. And through it all, Resident Evil has reminded us that horror works best when we care about survival. The franchise's willingness to take risks, shifting to action with RE4, returning to horror with RE7, remaking beloved classics, demonstrates creative confidence few series possess. Missteps like RE6's bloat or Operation Raccoon City's mediocrity haven't defined the franchise because Capcom learned from them, course-correcting while building on what worked. This adaptability has kept Resident Evil relevant across nearly 3 decades, multiple console generations, and seismic shifts in gaming trends. Looking forward, Resident Evil's future seems as bright as its past is storied. With RE9 on the horizon, continued remake possibilities, evolving VR technology, and Capcom's proven ability to innovate within the horror space, the franchise shows no signs of shambling into obscurity. New developers entering the industry grew up playing these games, bringing fresh perspectives while respecting the legacy they inherited. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the mansion where it all began. Remember the city that burned. Remember the villages, castles, and laboratories where humanity's darkest experiments unfolded. Remember that survival isn't just about ammunition counts or health bars. It's about the will to keep moving forward when everything wants you to stop. Remember that evil may be resident in dark places, but so is the courage to face it. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the darkness the next chapter of this incredible saga is being written, ready to terrify and thrill us once more when February 2026 arrives. The nightmare never truly ends, but that's why we keep coming back. Because in Resident Evil's darkness we've discovered something powerful. Our own capacity to survive, adapt, and ultimately triumph over the horrors that wait in the shadows. Good night.